Thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight. I'm thrilled to see so many people here, people who have come from outside the Lansing area, Detroit, Ann Arbor, all kinds of places. It's just, this is amazing. Thank you so much for braving the cold. Yeah, this is way beyond what I imagined, so thank you. Thank you for community members, colleagues, friends, everyone. My name is Kirsten Vermeglish. I'm a professor of history and Jewish studies at Michigan State University. This is the last in a multi-part series of programs accompanying the Traveling United States Holocaust Memorial Museum exhibit, Americans in the Holocaust, which is here at the Library of Michigan. It started here January 11th, and it's going to be here from February till February 22nd. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out, check it out. The USHMM, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, partnering with the American Library Association, has made this exhibit available to only 100 venues across the country. This is the second round of exhibits. This is the end. I understand they're not going to do it again. So we're really extremely fortunate to have it with us today. I really hope you'll take some time to visit it, and I'm really thrilled that it could bring so many people here. I have a lot of people that I need to thank, so please be patient with me. The first people that I need to thank are the Library of Michigan, and especially Matt Pacer, who I think is up there, and Eric too. Say hi, Matt. Matt and hi, Eric. They have been amazing partners and working together with the Sterling Institute. We've been working together for over a year on this project, and they have just been incredible partners. I also need to thank my own institute, the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, particularly my chair, Yael Aronoff, who has been an amazing supporter and cheerleader for this project, kept giving me anything I wanted whenever I asked for it. Almost, not really, but almost. Terry Champney for establishing the Leonard Irving Gilman Endowment for Lectures and Engagement in Jewish Culture and the Sterling Institute in honor of her late husband, Leonard Irving Gilman. And I also want to thank the Sterling board member and MSU psychology professor, Lauren Harris, for his endowment in our institute, the Jonathan Netanyahu Fund for the Study of the Jewish People and Antisemitism. I also want to thank Jeff Weidlinger and the Raoul Wallenberg Institute at the University of Michigan for their generous co-sponsorship for this entire series. And thanks to Karla for helping me out with that. I need to thank as well our co-sponsor to this event, the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan, who I didn't see, they brought sign. And their executive director, Kate Cangany. Gets her own applause. I want to also thank several other co-sponsors who have played extremely important roles in this evening's panel and also in the Americans and the Holocaust exhibit here in Lansing. This is the last of three public programs, and we actually had 2 other teacher workshops that have been incredible. So I need to thank all of these groups. And I'll also say actually that there will be another exhibit on Americans in the Holocaust, a Michigan perspective, that is going to be showing at the Broad Museum on MSU campus. And some of my students who are in the audience right now are going to be curating that exhibit. So I encourage everybody to go check out the Broad from May through November, you know who you are, and check out what they do, because it's going to be fantastic. So let me announce several other co-sponsors who've helped with this panel, but also with the work at the Broad and with all of our other panels as well. The Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum at Michigan State University, the Zeckelman Holocaust Center, the MSU Department of History, the Department of Arts, Cultural Management and Museum Studies, and the College of Education. So thank you to everyone, and I hope I didn't forget anyone, but thank you. Thank you for everything. Okay, so now I'd like to start what you've all been here for, rethinking the history of anti-Semitism in Michigan. We have an amazing panel here of speakers. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they all have to say. I'm going to give you their bios, and then they're going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes on their research. And then I'm going to ask them some questions for the entire panel, and then we'll open it up to audience conversation, okay? So first, here are my bios. Kevin Cangany is Executive Director of the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan. Previously, she was a tenured Associate Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. She holds a PhD in early American history from the University of Michigan. Karla Goldman is Saul Drackler Professor of Social Work and Professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, where she also directs the Jewish Communal Leadership Program. Her research interests focus on the American Jewish experience with special attention to the history of American Jewish communities, Jews at American universities, and the evolving identities of American Jewish women. She is working on a history of the Jewish community of Cincinnati and is the author of Beyond the Synagogue Gallery, Finding a Place for Women in American Judaism, which was published by Harvard University Press. John P. Jackson, Jr., is a professor at the James Madison College of Public Affairs at Michigan State University. He is a historian of racism and anti-Semitism in the post-World War II United States. He is the author or editor of 6 books and is working on a history of libertarianism and racism during the Civil Rights era. Andrew Lapin is a senior reporter with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. His stories cover anti-Semitism, debates over Israel, and other topics of concern to the Jewish world. They have received multiple American Jewish Press Association awards and are syndicated to dozens of media outlets around the globe. Andrew is also the creator and host of the nationally acclaimed podcast Radioactive, The Father Coughlin Story, co-produced with Tablet Studios and the WNET Group. The series explored the rise and fall of Detroit area radio demagogue Father Coughlin and helped lead his church to re-examine the priest's history of anti-Semitism. Andrew is a film critic for NPR and was previously the editor-in-chief of the Detroit Jewish News. And then finally, but not last but not least, is Victoria Saker Woeste. Did I get it right? All right. She is a history, I try not to mispronounce names for obvious reasons. She is a historian of American law with degrees from the University of Virginia and the University of California at Berkeley. Her most recent book, Henry Ford's War on Jews and the Legal Battle Against Hate Speech, relates the story of Ford's anti-Semitic libelous campaign against prominent Jewish campaigns during the 1920s, using previously undiscovered, unpublished sources. She is also the author of the Farmers Benevolent Trust, Law and Agricultural Cooperation in Industrial America, 1865 to 1945, and the co-editor of the collection, Jews and the Law. Coverage of her scholarship and her own commentary have appeared in The Washington Post, History News Network, Newsweek, The Huffington Post, Chronicle of Higher Education. She has served as historical advisor on several documentaries, including The People versus Leo Frank and Sapiro, the Jew Who Sued Henry Ford. Henry Ford's War has been optioned for film and television by Leviathan Productions of Los Angeles, which has hired Robert Rodat of Saving Private Ryan to write the screenplay. So we will all ask her about that during Q&A.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. So I started working on my Henry Ford book when I only had one child. I now have 4, and they're all grown up. But the book came out in 2012. So it's the kind of experience for a historian that is unusual in that I'm still being asked to give talks about a book that is over a decade old. And, and the movie. Every historian wants their book to be made into a movie. Every historian thinks, I have discovered some really scintillating characters here, some really important, people that lived at a time we need to understand. So I've been talking to Kirsten all day about this in a way, but I can't thank the felon-in-chief. Was that too partisan? But I have to say that it was as a result of the 2016 election that the interest in my work in particular really picked up. I went from giving academic talks to giving general audience talks and being asked to speak at a number of synagogues and places like that. I think, I don't want to belabor this, I think the really lasting contribution, I hope, of this work is that I asked the right questions that got me to the right sources, and it turned out that in all of the 50 or so biographies of Ford that I've counted, no one had been able to get to this material. And you can thank the Ford archives and how they were organized originally in so obscure and difficult to understand a system as possible, that I think a lot of historians looked at that weird system they had of organizing correspondence by the first two letters of the addressee's name and then by year. And it was too coded. I couldn't get into it either, but happily, the stuff that I needed was in the accession called the Aaron Sapiro case. So Aaron Sapiro is the hero of this story, and I think my book makes that clear. But he didn't get what he deserved. He did not get the justice that his case entitled him to. And as a result, there's a kind of ambivalence around discussing the case, the history of Ford's anti-Semitism, the Dearborn Independent, the International Jew, all of those topics. Sometimes you encounter them here, and a lot of times you don't. And, the whole Ford enclave in Dearborn is a place where you do not encounter Ford's career as an anti-Semite and a hate speech publisher. So that's the Michigan angle that I'd be happy to discuss.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you here today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is this man named Father Coughlin. When I was a kid growing up in suburban Detroit, there was a church about a mile from my house. Passed it every day. It was called the Shrine of the Little Flower. And if you know it in Royal Oak, you can't miss it. It's huge. It's about 100 feet tall. It's got this giant, statue of Jesus kind of carved into it. He's looking out across all of Woodward. And I remember as a kid, my dad would sort of point at that when we would drive by it, and he would say, you know anything about the guy who built this church? And I said, no. And he said, he had this radio show. The whole country listened to him. He told all these horrible lies about the Jews, and people liked it, and they gave him money for it. And I just thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard, and it stayed with me for so long. And it seemed like this long buried secret that nobody was really talking about, and that the church itself was not acknowledging. And then a few years ago, similar to Vicky's experience, suddenly everybody was talking about demagogues and who is a demagogue and what makes a demagogue and why are they so dangerous. And it got me thinking once again about Father Coughlin and a real urge I had to find a way to tell his story for a new generation, so that people could understand this fascination that I had with him, that I thought explained a lot about where we are as a society today. And what I found was really fascinating, because Father Coughlin was not just this sort of raging, hateful figure, but he was actually an incredibly popular and beloved media personality who, 4 years before he was going really overtly anti-Semitic, just gathered this huge following because he told people what they wanted to hear. He talked to them about economic concerns that spoke to their well-being. This was right after the Great Depression that he became this celebrity by talking about how the reason you're out of work, these are forces that have nothing to do with you. These are forces related to these giant international banks and this distant threat of communism that is slowly, lapping up on our shores. And he would tell audiences these things every week. He would talk about how horribly the president was running the country. He became this voice of leading opposition, and he would just start to say over a period of many years, what all these forces have in common is that they're all Jews. And the subtlety and the sort of long-term project of Father Coughlin's radio show, which was on the air for 14 years from 1926 until really leading right up until the U.S. enters World War II, is that he found a way to become America's leading proponent of fascist and anti-Semitic ideology, all from right here in Michigan, because Detroit was in many ways, the industrial and cultural center of America at that time. And so he had this reach, he had this fame, and he used it to prop up his own sense of self-worth by finding and targeting what he saw as this enemy force, the Jewish people. even as a growing number of Jewish groups were trying to sound the alarm, telling everybody, this man is dangerous, you can't give him a platform, he continued to have the political force and strength that he almost became this untouchable figure, until he pushed it too far by attempting to run a candidate against Franklin Roosevelt in the 1936 election. And then when that failed, actually actively fomenting an anti-government militia that he hoped would answer only to him and would eventually overthrow the United States government. This failed, but it didn't fail quite as spectacularly as you might be led to believe. And it was only because of this increased radicalism that the forces in charge of him, meaning the Catholic Church, but also the FBI and kind of other big institutions that had done nothing for so many years, finally said enough is enough, and they found a way to deplatform him, but not before he had created this really toxic legacy that went over the airwaves and into the homes of so many Americans. And people really find this story very resonant when I tell it today. And the nice little coda that very recently I've been able to put on the story is that a couple years after the podcast came out, the Shrine of the Little Flower actually did start engaging in dialogues with the local Jewish community, did start to rephrase and reframe their own history of who Father Coughlin was. They started for the first time to say that he was anti-Semitic, that he used anti-Semitic rhetoric. And they have led, I believe, education tours to the Holocaust Museum for their parishioners. This kind of thing would have been unthinkable just a few short years ago. That was my journey with Father Coughlin, and I'm excited to talk more about it later.
Thanks. So while my colleagues are talking about, the most famous anti-Semites in American history, right, all centered in Michigan, which is a kind of a fascinating thing, I'm going to look at a more sort of ambivalent space around anti-Semitism in the same period that we've been talking about. Here you see Henry Ford, the hero of our first speaker, or not the anti-hero, I should say. Shapiro is a hero, sorry, getting an honorary degree at the University of Michigan in 1926, right? And this is certainly the period in which his role as anti-Semite in chief was really fully on display. With the president of the University of Michigan at that time, Clarence Cook Little, C.C. Little. Try and hit sort of very quickly a few high points, some sort of reference points for us to think about what was going on at a very central place, not quite MSU, but the University of Michigan, in the state, and how sort of the anti-Semitism of the time was reflected there and ways in which it wasn't reflected there. I start with C.C. Little, who came to Michigan from the Northeast in 1925. He was a classic Harvard guy. He'd then been president of the University of Maine, youngest president in the country at age 32, comes to Michigan at age 36, and he brings this whole new regime in higher education, which is the application process. And you may know that the application process to college that we have now was introduced in the 1920s, chiefly as a way to identify Jewish students and restrict their numbers. Didn't know that, but that's an important thing to know, not just about, but it did not manifest that way in Michigan. To the left, you see the application form that C.C. Little introduced when he was president here. He was here from 1925 to 1929. And a significant thing that the Michigan application does not ask, that all those applications in the Northeast asked, was, what is your religious preference, or what is your religion? So while they asked about the birthplace of one's parents and one's father's occupation, I've seen there's no indication in many of these applications that Jewish students are indeed Jewish. They only asked about religion once students got there, and then it was an optional thing. They gave it to the sort of Hillel and the churches. You could say no preference. And based on a variety of records, these are sort of approximations of the number of Jews in Michigan. It actually goes up in this period from about 600 to 800. It hovers around 8%, gets to 10%. And interestingly, if you look at this one on the left, you can see that the third biggest sect by denomination at the University of Michigan in 1934 was Jewish, right? And see that Catholics even fall below that. And also they beat out Episcopalians. Of course, the Protestants are dividing by denomination. And actually the biggest preference in this list was no preference. So maybe sort of like today, which was almost 2,000. The Jewish students thought that most of the people indicating no preference might have been Jewish. There were exclusions at the University of Michigan. One of the places you can see this the most is in fraternities and sororities. And if you can see my yellow lines there, you can sort of see on the one going down, there were fraternities that were exclusively Jewish. You can see they're dominated by Jewish and no preference. And that line, that row, is pretty absent in all of the other ones. And it's interesting, there's one Catholic fraternity here, which had 17 members, but then there are Catholics scattered throughout the other Protestant or frats. So that tells you something about the ways things were divided there. The biggest thing that students faced was women students. All housing, women's housing at Michigan in the 1920s and going forward had to be approved by the Michigan League. And most of those houses that were approved did not accept Jewish students, they did not accept Black students. So there were houses specifically for African American women and for Jewish women. And it was a concern, I can say more about that later, that the university is actually interested in the welfare of these. The president asked about what accommodations they were. And the introduction of the first housing, large dorm, Mosher Jordan, was in part to respond to the problem of not enough room for these students. There were 72 Jewish students in Mosher when it opened in 1930. Okay, so just a couple more things. If you've been to this University of Michigan, you've probably been to the beautiful Law Quad and the William W. Cook Legal Library is the most beautiful space probably on campus, best place to study if they'll let you in. If you're not a law student. But who was William W. Cook? So this is sort of at the core, tells us something about, and I'll just sort of, I think, end with this. When C.C. Little was inaugurated as president, the first regents meeting, they got a note from the representative, William W. Cook, who is the person who was a law school graduate, basically funded that entire law quad. He had already built the Lawyers Club, and they wanted him to build more. He sent a note which instructed the regents about this Lawyers Club that he had funded, which was basically a dorm for law students, that they should, quote, discharge the woman there in charge, remove the piano from the parlors, and refuse all Jews admission. Now, the historian who's sort of a semi-biographer of William W. Cook says, oh, well, it was the case that was just the anti-Semitism of the time, right? There was for it already all out there. This is what people thought. But I think what I want to draw your attention to is how the regents responded. They said, when he says you must discriminate among sects, he has gone further than we can allow him. They were basically dumbfounded and aghast. And they charged Little, their new president, to go to Cook and talk him down from this, which he did eventually. But one of Little's problems, he had a number of them, but one of his problems ultimately was that Cook would come back with these requests to exclude Jewish students, to exclude Black students. And the regents and the administration weren't having that. So what we generally have is a school that did not discriminate against Jews, as far as we can see as undergrads, in the 1920s and 30s. Perhaps I'll talk further about the ways in which it did occur to them to discriminate, and not against Black students either. And they saw that as part of the creed of the university. So while there were definitely exclusions, and I can talk further about some of those, there was also this sense of one of the things that was going to make the University of Michigan strong was these students coming from out of state. With the quotas in Northeastern schools, more people, Jewish families looked to the West, to Wisconsin and Michigan. And that was one of the things that elevated the standards of the university and made it a national university. So I look forward to talking a bit more about it.
Okay, so I'm here to talk about the Michigan and really the Detroit Jewish community's responses to anti-Semitism during World War II. We're jumping forward in time. We could talk about this extensively. I'm going to boil it down to 5 big points. Okay, the first point is we have to talk about Phil Slomovitz, founding editor of the Detroit Jewish News, before that, the Chronicle. This man was responsible for educating the community about what was going on in Europe in the 1930s and early 40s, relying on information from the JTA and republishing it, and not only disseminating it to his readers, but also going to the State Department at the very time the State Department was concealing what was going on in Europe to try to effect some change. So we have to give Phil Slomovitz his due. Phil Slomovitz's work also led to a modest protest movement in Detroit. It's not on the scale that we see in Chicago or New York, but it did exist, particularly in the late 1930s. And the anti-Nazi rallies were drawing about 5,000 people. So again, modest, but something and a direct response to Slomovitz's work. The big consequence, the big statement that the community makes is about infrastructure. So if you think about a lot of the Jewish organizations that we have today, what we now know as Federation, Hebrew Free Loan, HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Landsmannschaften, these are mutual aid societies formed by people from the same little shtetl in the Pale. These organizations and others had been, in large part, created in a previous era when Eastern European Jews were fleeing pogroms beginning in 1881. So this infrastructure that was for and by Eastern European Jewish immigrants then was leveraged to help survivors when survivors started coming to Detroit in the 1930s. So this is infrastructure that's helping the next wave. So at the same time that this infrastructure was helping survivors, it was also being tweaked a bit, augmented to help even more. Detroit's Jewish Federation was the first federation in the United States to yoke its annual campaign to a war chest. So war chests were joint fundraisers. Lots of organizations and in some cases businesses pooled together, jointly fundraised for monies to support the war effort. So our federation was the first in the country that did that. And when Federation was involved in those war chest campaigns, they were always record breakers. You may know, and this is true even today, that the Detroit Jewish community is incredibly philanthropic. We are the 23rd largest community in the United States, but you are number 1 in philanthropy per capita. Isn't that incredible? So yes, and that has been true since the community's existence. So that is something to be incredibly proud of. So fundraising for the war effort came very naturally to the Detroit Jewish community and made an incredible difference. But the other thing that we need to talk about is service, and that is service especially to the war effort. In this time period, Jews represented about 4% of the U.S. population, 4%, but 8% of the U.S. military. That's nationally, so double their proportion nationally. Okay, that's impressive. In Detroit, it's even higher. It's 11% in Detroit. So this is an incredibly patriotic and also generous community. So even though the information they were largely getting was modest, in some cases downplayed. Phil Slomovitz was working with what he had. It wasn't a whole lot. Protest movements were pretty non-existent. But in terms of supporting the war effort through money and military service, oh man, it is hard to beat that record. Thank you.
I'm learning so much. I'm glad I'm here. In 1947, Arnold Forster of the Anti-Defamation League published kind of a major book on study of anti-Semitism in the United States, and he said there are 3 main, big-time, dangerous anti-Semites. A man named Merwin K. Hart of the National Economic Council, whom he described as a clever bigot because he always hid his anti-Semitism in code words that if you knew, you knew, and if you didn't, but also had plausible deniability that I'm not talking about Jews. I mean, most people don't know about Merwin K. Hart. The second group was the Ku Klux Klan. Not clever bigots. And I don't think I'm going to talk much about the Klan. The third was a man named Smith. Most boring name you could think of. Gerald Lyman Kenneth Smith, here in Detroit. So Gerald Smith was born in 1898 in Wisconsin. He's a Midwesterner. And is drafted he becomes he's a minister, ordained minister of the Disciple of Christ Church, and moves to Louisiana in 1929 and hooks up with Huey Long, who until about 3 weeks ago was considered the most dangerous fascist in the United States. Smith was a preacher. He was a spellbinding orator, and he could hold audiences in the palm of his hand. And while he was a great ally, he also was a demagogue. And if you're an organization that already has a demagogue, it's hard to make room for two demagogues. Smith leaves the organization when Huey Long is assassinated in 1935 and bounces around for a while until in 1942 ends up in Detroit. So why does he come to Detroit after being in Louisiana, being in Georgia, being in New York City? And his biographer talks about different reasons. One is he's a Midwesterner, and he's just culturally Midwest. I'm a Midwesterner. I spent about 20 years outside the Midwest. I'm back in Michigan now, which as an Iowan, I consider just barely Midwest, but still. Second, it's a friendly business community for him here. He thought that he could get some good fundraising going among local businesses. Third, good broadcasting facilities. Father Coughlin was staggeringly popular. The biggest media personality in the United States up until then. Henry Ford was here. And the audiences were more friendly than he found in New York City. And for the first time, Smith's organization, the Committee of 1 Million, probably really did have 1 million followers. For Smith, during World War II, was a pronounced isolationist, as many on the American right were. And this did not necessarily mean if you were an isolationist, you were anti-Semitic, but those people who didn't hate the Jews, who were trying to keep us out of the war, had trouble managing the anti-Semites who were there, Charles Lindbergh being the most famous one. Also in Michigan, Smith had good cooperation with Senator Arthur Vandenberg, Representative Claire Hoffman, and of course Henry Ford, whom he met only once, but often described as his close personal friend. They're not the most honest people, these folks. Also at this time, he began getting major funding from big-time businessmen who were interested in underwriting free market capitalist ideas. The DuPont brothers, Pierre and I think it's Irene. Any French speakers in there? I apologize to the French speakers. Better Living Through Chemistry, that DuPont. Sun Oil President J. Howard Pugh, later became Sunco. These people were among the major underwriters of free market kind of publications tied to a particular brand of Christianity, which thought that Christ himself preached the benefits of laissez-faire economics. Taxes are stealing, stealing is wrong, that kind of thing. Historians sometimes make this distinction between kind of religious anti-Semitism of blood libel that comes from kind of medieval thought, and political anti-Semitism, which just thinks Jews are in charge of the government. For these people, those were one and the same. Jews after the war, as we all know, were arguing for fair labor practices, for non-discrimination in public accommodations, for the ending of Jim Crow, all of which were seen as threats to the right of contract for free market people to engage in free choice. The other thing that he did when he was here is he ran for Senate in 1942, lost, he won, I don't know, 5 votes or something like that. He lost, and after that, he kind of gave up the idea that he could reform the political system, became a crusader full-time against Jewish control of banking, Jewish control of the government. He despised FDR, of course, and became even more anti-Semitic and outspoken. In 1944, he ran as president, knowing he would lose, but using it as a way to gain national attention. And something else that happened in 1944 that I really, if there's local historians here, come talk to me. One of the platforms of the America First Party, his party in 1944, was creating a government program to ship African Americans back to Africa. The idea, so part of my research program is looking at these strange alliances between white nationalists and black nationalists. And a local attorney in Detroit, Ramon A. Martinez, was the head of the Negro Nationalist Society and had, in fact, written a bill in the 1930s that was taken up by Mississippi Senator Theodore Bilbo, yes, that was his name, who was racist even by 1930s Mississippi standards, which the Greater Liberia Bill, which died, and Martinez was convinced that these alliances with white nationalists aren't going to work, that black people need to do this themselves, and Smith just steals it. And as Martinez said, it's the kiss of death for us. So anybody who knows anything about that, come talk to me. Michigan is when Smith has the greatest influence. He moves to California. He ends his life in 1976 in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, trying to build a Christian theme park, which didn't go very well. So, Detroit's biggest anti-Semitic organizer enjoyed his biggest fame when he was in Detroit.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for these really, I hope there's a lot here, even more than I really imagined when I asked you all to participate. So I'm really, really excited to hear more, hear you have more of a conversation. I wonder if we could start by maybe talking about Michigan, if you are comfortable with it. If you're not, you can pass, but why Michigan? Why are Coughlin and Ford and Smith more successful here? And if you don't know, then that's fine, but is it a coincidence, or do you want to give any thoughts about why this is? Because it does seem really strange when I talk to students about it.
When we were having all this fuss some years ago about social media and the far-right white supremacists on, say, Twitter, there was a discussion that kind of went, man owns a bar, there's a guy in the corner with swastika tattoos, guy kicks him out right away. Well, it's just one guy, why are you doing that? He said, no. You let one Nazi in, pretty soon it's a Nazi bar. Henry Ford is here. Father Coughlin is here. Gerald Smith comes because they are here. So that's one reason.
So Father Coughlin was an immigrant from Canada, and he saw a lot of appeal in Detroit. He attended seminary in Windsor so he could see Detroit across the river, right? And this was in the 1920s. And I sort of alluded to this when I was speaking earlier, but Detroit was absolutely the place you wanted to be in the 1920s. It was a huge boomtown. Ford's auto industry had put this city on the map. Middle-class jobs were plentiful, were easy to come by. There were all sorts of different ethnic and immigrant groups coming to the city to work in these plants and the assorted industries that built up around them. And so Coughlin saw this as the land of prosperity, as the place where he could go if he sought influence, which he very much did. And so he came to Michigan because of its ascendancy, and he came right at this moment when the local Catholic Church was looking for a new priest, and he was able to fill that role. He was able to connect himself with the wealthy industrialists in the city who were there because they were making their fortunes in the automobile industry, and they bankrolled his very brazen attempt to launch an independent radio show that he was going to syndicate across the entire country, and that was going to pay for his church. He, similar to Smith, a few years later, Coughlin found the resources he needed in Detroit to find that national platform that he was seeking. And because his followers were so diffuse, because they were not just local, he had very far-reaching implications. But of course, there were people, followers of him, who were making pilgrimages to Royal Oak, to the shrine, to deliver their contributions to him personally, or just to see him, or to attend his sermons. So he then also became a magnet. And if you like his ideas, you probably like the anti-Semitic ones too. It was that kind of snowball effect. But it's funny how often I have to remind people today. It's like, no, everybody wanted to be in Detroit in the early 20th century. It was the place to be. It was where you had culture and where you had any kind of hope at a middle class life. So that's why he came here. Do you want to speak to Ford?
Well, Ford was born in Michigan. Didn't need to come from anywhere else. But as you all know, his factories drew workers from all over, including the South. And that migration had the effect of adding color, literally, to what had been a previously fairly homogeneous society. I actually do not know much about the presence of Jews in Michigan over time, how many there were. But I think it's probably important to mention Rabbi Franklin, who was, for a time, Ford's best friend. They lived next to each other in Detroit, and when Ford built Fairlane, the mansion in Dearborn, Rabbi Franklin could not follow him there because Dearborn had already legislated that no Jews could buy property in the suburb, which is especially ironic given that now it contains the nation's highest concentration of Arabs and Arab Americans. So I think the fact that Rabbi Franklin had this rabbinic career in Detroit, and that the first synagogue, I can't remember the name of the synagogue, Bethel, Temple Bethel, was such a beautiful building, suggests that there were there was a minyan, there was a quorum, and that they had resources. So I think it's interesting to ask the question, why Michigan? But I think part of it has to be an investigation into who was already here and how did migration and economic change disrupt those communities or that community, and make this sort of radical turn more attractive to people.
Of course, the architect of the two Temple Bethel buildings in Detroit were also Ford's favorite architect, Albert Kahn, who also designed most of the central campus buildings at the University of Michigan. So there's this interesting kind of mix here. And of course, Ford, and the cars helped create this society that then he hates so much and blames on the Jews. So there's an irony there. And I'd say, but it's interesting, like how important I think Ford in the auto industry was. Obviously, most of you know the University of Michigan is an old university. Some say 1817, some say 1837. I say 1837 when they actually had students. one of the reasons it was, so it started strong actually, but one of the reasons it became and remained so strong was because of the auto industry, right? Because it was funded by a mill tax. So as long as you had this wealth from the auto industry, the university was benefiting hugely. But it was benefiting in a way that I think didn't mean that it was going to follow the trends set by maybe those pushing against change, right? So when, for instance, when C.C. Little comes to Michigan in 1925, he's a man of the East. He's the old Boston Brahmin. His great-great-grandfather was Paul Revere. But he's the brave new man, the brash new man, ready for the West, the openness of the West, and its new ideas, right? And so he's known as a eugenicist, but I will say that he was a scientist, a eugenicist scientist. And I've seen that that makes them assume that he supported, say, prejudice against Jews and blacks. But to the contrary, he said, here you have universities. We want to find, as a eugenicist, he didn't say that, but we want to find who's best suited to the university. And we have all this data. But we have no idea who it is. Who's to say it's the product of two Anglo-Saxons? Maybe I have this quote, it's the product of the Irish and the, creative Russian. Their child is going to be the best student. So he was like, let's find out. But let's not make any assumptions about it. And so that the openness of the university in some ways was a counter to the things that we're talking about. And I'll just say, in preparation for this, I was looking up in the Michigan Daily their references to Ford, to Father Coughlin, and they sort of report them in the way of news. It was interesting. It's not until Coughlin really goes into this very brazen anti-Semitism in the late 30s that then the Daily kind of mocks him. Right, so they sort of are looking at from a distance at these things. When Ford comes out with these screeds, they don't report it as, this great man said it. They're like, Ford is saying this. It was a much more sort of bemused and critical eye on that. So in some ways, I think that they saw the university representing a different trend, and not that. And again, we'll probably come back to it. There weren't lots of examples of anti-Semitism there, but just a different sense of what. This is an argument about what our society should look like and who Americans are. And the university, at times, reflects sort of what's written in the status quo, but at times it tries to open that up.
So, Karla, your last point about, what should America look like is actually what I was going to add to this discussion. And so much of the fear and the anxiety that undergirds anti-Semitism in this period and others is economic, right, and labor. And so I think a lot of that anxiety comes out specifically in Detroit at a moment when the workforce is changing, the composition of it is changing, at a moment when Henry Ford and others, as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, are really worried about their place in society and whether or not the United States will continue to look the way he wants it to look. So I think, Detroit's not the only place where this is happening, but because of automotive industry and other things, a lot of these anxieties are coming out in ways that I think help explain why Detroit.
That's super interesting. Thank you so much. And this maybe sort of helps for the next question that I wanted to ask, which is how has anti-Semitism intersected with other ideologies of hate? And in Michigan or in the broader U.S., thinking about the characters or the other materials, but maybe in particular, sort of focusing on Michigan and some of the spaces that you all are talking about.
Well, someone should talk about the Black Legion. Okay, so I guess it's me. Okay, well, I'll start and then you clean it up. Okay, so the Black Legion is this breakaway movement from the Klan. It's more violent. It's more hateful, and it's got a Michigan chapter, right? It's Michigan based, and so there was a move afoot within the Black Legion to place a bomb in every synagogue on Yom Kippur. That was fortunately foiled, but the idea was to kill 1 million Jewish Americans, and that was a Michigan idea. Let's see, you'll have to look it up. I'm fuzzy on the date, like at the 20s. Yeah. Anyway, so I think we need to talk about the ways in which hatred of African Americans and hatred of Jewish Americans, is intersecting in this period, including in organizations like the Black Legion.
I guess I would add to that. I believe this is a different group, but another institution that got its start in Detroit was the Nation of Islam in the early 20s, I believe, and certainly now has become, under the now decades-long leadership of Louis Farrakhan, like one of the sort of most prominent anti-Semitic organs in the country that had sort of based its whole notion of Black liberation on the idea that blacks needed to be liberated from the Jews. And so that, I think, comes out of, if I was going to like theorize about why is Michigan the place where all this is happening, it's sort of related to this idea that the workforce in Detroit, the labor force at the time, was very multi-ethnic, very multicultural, but also in these very pronounced ethnic enclaves. This was not like a harmonious tale of racial and ethnic reconciliation. The city of Detroit was very divided. It had these large black populations who had come up from the Great Migration. It had just a couple of very highly concentrated Jewish areas, and then it had huge quantities of immigrants from other countries, each living in their own sort of ethnic corners, and there was already kind of a lot of bubbling strife, which of course would hit its peak in '67, where you see Jewish migration patterns leaving the city in the same patterns as the white flight of the time. So that's why anti-Semitism becomes a very difficult thing to talk about as it relates to the other ideologies of hate, because although it is true that white supremacists, people who tend to hate everybody, particularly hate the Jews, which you also see in the various militias that have been a very prominent force in other corners of the state for decades. It's also true that anti-Semitism is its own thing, and that it doesn't always follow the patterns that you would expect from, certainly the way we talk about intersectionality today. It doesn't quite line up with how people think about persecuted minority populations. We're seeing some of this play out today in different environments, certainly around progressive activism with regards to Israel-Palestine. It becomes a very tricky thing, and because I cover this, on a daily basis, I sort of get this, I would say, longitudinal view, right? Because I've done some of the historical work, but then I also am doing the journalism work on every day, and so I can see that you may have heard it before, and I know it sounds like a cliche, but it is true that there can be anti-Semites across the entire political spectrum. It is not just coming from one corner, and it is really important as we have sort of broader discussions of what anti-Semitism is and how we can fight it in the present day, that we understand the various ways it has contorted and defied our usual categorization of hate in the past. Okay, go ahead.
I have something to say. I'm learning a lot here. I'm realizing just how narrowly I partook of Michigan history, Detroit history. I mean, my focus was on that libel lawsuit and the legal process before and after. So I apologize for not knowing about the Black Legion. But I do want to talk about, and here I'll try to give the broader view, how Jews experienced anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic prejudice in this country. Unlike African Americans after the end of slavery, Jews did not experience legislated discrimination except for redlining, which is the practice of excluding people from purchasing land in certain places. And so that made it even more awkward when it was encountered, such as at the resorts in upstate New York. And it also raised the really important issue of whether or not, when hotels or other institutions refuse them accommodations, Jews should sue. And there was no consensus around that. And so the leadership of the American Jewish Committee believed that suing over social anti-Semitism was not a good idea. But if anything, attitudes towards Jews and Jewish inclusion as full citizens hardened during the 20s, exactly in the time that Claire is talking about, that quotas essentially instilled at the University of Michigan. The quotas were also applied at law firms, white shoe law firms in New York City. So what did Jewish lawyers do? They formed their own law firms. What did Jews do in wanting to recreate? They formed their own social clubs and patronized, establishments that catered specifically to Jews. And so there's this kind of parallel track where there wasn't a color barrier. There was a social barrier that that Jews simply walked around and created their own social space in spite of it. There were, however, examples of segregation that looks exactly like what blacks encountered. For instance, signs that said Gentiles only in the swimming pool, the ads that were circulated to advertise exclusion that read, no Jews, no tuberculetics, and no dogs, that kind of clumping together of unwanted categories of people and things. So I think that American Jewish historians, that is, historians of Jewish America, are making headway in placing these social practices in the broader history of the civil rights movement, and it's been a really fascinating field that's evolving now within Jewish history.
I think what comes up again is sort of this idea of what America should look like, right? Because again, there's the irony: who brought all this variety of people to Detroit? Ford. And Jews did also come to the auto industry, not always working for Ford, but like many of the ancillary businesses around that supported the auto industry. And you also see this sort of playing out in universities. And Kirsten has written about MSU more in terms of how it sort of adjusted to outsiders, which Jews represented. And Jews were sort of the quintessential outsiders in the university. And these universities in the 1920s were more diverse than, at least Michigan was, than we might think. So if you look at the yearbooks from the 1920s, there's the Negro Caucasian Club, there's a Nipponese society, there's a Hindustan group, there's the Chinese students, big pictures of big groups of students, right, who were making their way. There was a Cosmopolitan Club, which was international students, in this space that was, but that was still a very white space. And of course, the fraternities and sororities I talked about as an example of what Victoria is talking about with the country clubs and such, right? You're not allowed into these white Christian ones, so you'll form your own and do the same thing, which was a thing that sort of Jews were able to do maybe more than other groups. But there was just this interesting observation by the dean of engineering at Michigan in 1926. They had surveyed their students, and he wrote a report on the survey, and he boasted that 94% of the school students, as well as 75% of their parents, and 53% of their grandparents were all born in the United States. So the idea there was a Native American suggested something, and we get even a little more insight into what he was bragging about when he goes on to say that, okay, that's 53% of their grandparents were born in the US, and then 33%, so now we only have about 15% less. 33% of the grandparents had been born in, note, England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Holland, or Scandinavia. So this was, and so he happily concludes, this offered reassuring evidence of the fundamental soundness of the racial stock from which our students are derived, okay? So that's one thought about who should be at the university, who are going to be the best engineers, who deserve to be engineers. But then you see what's happening with all those clubs. Like, universities actually welcoming people from other countries of different hues and identities. And so again, it's sort of this tension about what does it mean to sort of be creating the future in some ways. I think I wanted to say one more thing about so in some ways what you're seeing, right, why are Jews so threatening? We try to understand these people who are white passing and whatever, but they represented this threat of the outsider, right? Which was not just the Jews, right? It was all those other groups. Could they, like the Jews, begin to find, why were they all showing up at the university, finding their way inside? I mean, another important exclusion, fundamental exclusion of the 1920s were the Immigration Restriction Acts, which basically just completely cut off immigration from Eastern Europe, Jewish immigration, and from Southern Europe of Italians and others, so that, again, it was like that. It resonates, obviously, with today. What should America look like, right? And those laws very clearly, as efforts today indicate, who is a threat to the society that we envision for ourselves. And one of the reasons Jews were a threat, and this goes a little bit to, I think, to Kirsten's question, is in the mid-1930s, in the midst of the Depression, was a real good era for radical activism. And in 1935, at a lot of universities, the National Student League was fomenting lots of trouble. At the University of Michigan, there had a few different expressions that year. The most famous it was when the athletic director, famous guy, Yost, and the football coach said that Willis Ward, who was the one black student on the football team, would not play in the game against Georgia Tech because Georgia Tech didn't want to play against him. And it was a big uprising on the university, but they didn't play him. It was actually the one game that Michigan won that year. But what happened at the end of that year, and there were a number of other sort of causes that meant, had the National Student League, organizing. 4 students were expelled during the summer, and they were all Jews from New York or New Jersey. And after that, the university actually considered. I said Michigan never had a quota undergrads. They considered a quota for out-of-state students, which they decided not to do. But they did end up they said, well, people who are applying from the New York area, we're going to interview them. We're going to send interviewers to New York and interview the applicants. And of those people who applied, many more non-Jewish students were admitted than Jewish students. They still did admit Jewish students. But again, it was a threat, it was sort of what these students came to represent, which was sort of the diversity, support for those who are not like those who had occupied these seats before, or been the population of this state in a way that you needed to recognize them before. It was like whose voices should count.
I just want to circle back to this distinction between social discrimination and legalized discrimination, because that distinction was the foundation of Jim Crow. The idea that separate but equal is guaranteed. 14th Amendment guarantees of equal protection of the laws are satisfied under conditions of separate accommodations, as long as those accommodations are equal, because the right of a black person to sit next to a white person on a train or something is in fact a social equality, which the Constitution is silent about. Legal equality is guaranteed by separate but equal. And so this idea of social discrimination being this separate thing apart from legal discrimination, and hence faces no constitutional challenges, is the foundation of Jim Crow. And it is also, as we know, the kind of discrimination that American Jews were subject to. No Jews in this swimming pool, this is not your hotel, all of that stuff. And so in the 1930s, especially with the rise of the New Deal, this idea started coming forth of, and primarily from architects of the New Deal, John Dewey, the philosopher, and Jewish legal scholars, that in fact the modern corporation should be considered a private government, that it has the power that we give to the governments, and the free market answer to abuse of employers on employees is, of course, well, you can leave. The employee can leave. That is freedom, which is a little silly. right? Yeah, you can just leave U.S. Steel or Ford and do something else. And particularly in the American Jewish Congress in the post-war world, this attack, this foundational notion of private government was the foundation of fair employment law in various states across the nation, and the attack on public accommodations. Public accommodations was also a linchpin of Jim Crow in the 19th century, which I don't have time to go into, but it's an interesting story. Go look it up. And but the idea, and the free market economists, and of course the South, were like, public accommodation is a particular legal category and has with it certain burdens. And they said, if you demand that people let just anybody into the restaurant on the basis of race, that will just destroy the economy. 1964, Title II of the Civil Rights Act, which bans racial and religious discrimination in public accommodations, is the single most effective civil rights measure that comes out of that act. It was smooth. The famous Green Book, where the Negro Motorist book, that indicated the free market will supply you hotels if you're lucky, if you can find these places and these restaurants when you're driving across the country, ceases publication immediately. So social discrimination and legal discrimination are intertwined in very complex and interesting ways, and this was a place where, at least up until the 1960s, American Jews and African Americans worked very closely, hand in hand.
All right, thank you so much. So I have one more question, then I want to be able to leave it to the group, and maybe this is something that Karla and Katie particularly might be able to sort of talk about, is the impact on the Jewish community. I've read a few things that sort of talk about how when we talk about anti-Semitism, we rarely talk, and maybe Vic, you would talk about this as well, but people don't always talk about how the Jewish community actually responds. You mentioned a little bit in talking about protests, but I wonder if you could talk more about whether this shaped the Jewish community in Michigan, the experience of being a famous face of anti-Semitism. What would you say?
It's fascinating to look at the self-expression of, say, Jewish students in the 1930s around this stuff as Hitler is rising in Europe, what they're very aware of. I will say this is interesting given what we've said about Michigan. I recently was reading about sort of this parallel time at the University of Wisconsin, and the sort of explicit and overt anti-Semitism on the Wisconsin campus was a lot more virulent than at Michigan. Right, at Michigan, they are. It's, as I say, it's sort of observational. In 1938-39, they conduct the sort of Office of basically of Religious Life, which is the Student Christian Association mainly, do these surveys, and they do an extensive survey on anti-Semitism, right? And you don't do a survey on anti-Semitism just because we like it, right? You do it because you see it as a problem. But it's a fascinating survey because one of the things it says is, do you think Jews are too clannish? Would you live with someone who's, like, they use all these stereotypes, and they say, what do you think about, they just ask as a question, do you agree with this stereotype? Would you live with a Jew? Would you let your sister date one? I mean, those are the kinds of questions which are very interesting. So, but it shows an interest and somewhat a responsibility for it. The reflections of Jews, there was a Hillel News at Michigan for a few decades, which is an amazing source for understanding what Jewish experience was like. And there are these reflections there about how Jewish students should behave, right? When there are all these radicals on campus, they say, don't be a if you're going to be a radical, you don't have to be a leader. Right? Because if you're a leader, then everybody's going to say, oh, it's all the Jews or all the radicals, right? Like, don't stand out. And there's also a thing, there are awareness of sort of the anti-Jewish stereotypes, which, everybody seemed to know who was Jewish because of what people wore and how loud they spoke and how they didn't fit in. And there's a sort of this debate about, you should really some saying, Shah, you should really try and fit in. And others saying, this is the worst time to say that. At a time of such growing anti-Semitism, we should not be controlled by those who would tell us how to be. And it's a really, I'm actually going to use these texts with my students tomorrow, like to try and think about with the position that they were in, right, of wanting, you go to college, you don't go to Wayne State, you go to the University of Michigan or maybe to Lansing, East Lansing, to be American, right? And then you get there and then you're treated as a Jew, which of course the Jewish community wanted them also to be Jews and Americans. But I'll just sort of end with this. After Kristallnacht, that was a thing that in the Detroit News, I'm sure, in the Michigan Daily, right, hit the headlines big time. All this, we're aware of what's been going on against Jews in Germany, but now it is this critical moment. And the Jewish students and others tried to organize around that, and they said, we want to have a protest. They asked if there could be a day off or hours off from class from a protest, and the dean said no. Well, we're going to have a protest. The governor says he'll come, but then he was delayed. And so they're delayed, and then it's, Kristallnacht is November 8th. They report on it in the Michigan papers, November 15th, 16th, and then it's like Thanksgiving and people forget. But the other thing I'll say is that, of course, at that time, think about how complicated our news is now, how much is happening. In the lead up to World War II, it wasn't just what was happening to the Jews in Germany, it was what's happening to the Chinese under Japanese rule. There are so many different things going on, people suffering around the world, that it's hard to bring attention to one thing. But there's a fascinating cover of the Michigan Daily where they report on Kristallnacht, and then also they report on like the German student union, listening to a visiting student telling them about sports under the Reich. Like there's just sort of this mixture of things going on, which makes it hard for them to get any traction to say, look what's happening to us. And also during and into the war, fraternities and sororities organized to host refugee students, which is an interesting thing that they do that's positive. Oh, I'll say one more thing, sorry. There's a sort of article from Hillel where they're raising money to support refugees, to support Jews in Germany. Things are dire. This is in the 1930s, and they're going to have like the Hillel Gala, and they're like, "How do we do this? We're having a party, and we're raising money for people are suffering really tough things, and that's what we have to do." So it's just actually again an interesting reflection on the struggles we face now.
Okay, so I'm going to out myself. Obviously, I'm not Jewish, but I'm also not a Michigander. I'm a Hoosier. So when I was doing research for, exactly, when I was doing research to understand Henry Ford and what's going on in Detroit, and I was talking to people who had lived through it or their parents had lived through it, and this is not going to be news to any of you, but it was news to me, right? The thing that breaks Henry Ford's campaign against the Jewish community is the economic boycott that Jews and also evangelical Christians were participating in. And that is really what turned Henry Ford to realize, this is really pinching my sales, right? I got to drop this campaign. But it's also things like, Andrew, what you alluded to at the beginning, right? That the Jewish community today, a lot of people are still uncomfortable driving by the shrine. So, right? So there are these ways that these events of, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, are still resonant in the community, and the community's still feeling those feelings, right? And there's still anxiety about buying Ford or going by the shrine and whatnot. So there are also those kind of economic and social ways, I think, of combating anti-Semitism that really helped, in Ford's case and Coughlin's, bring them down, bring their platforms down.
So the Jewish communal response to Father Coughlin was super interesting and instructive for today, because they immediately recognized the dangers of his rhetoric. They recognized also that it was coded, that people not from the Jewish community would have difficulty understanding it as anti-Semitic if they weren't taking, a sociology class or something. And so Jewish communal leaders, including Rabbi Stephen Wise, were very careful and very circumspect in how they tried to sound a very faint alarm bell about how dangerous they thought Coughlin was. They were being very careful. They wouldn't say, we think Father Coughlin is anti-Semitic and he needs to be pulled off the air. They said, you know, there's a risk. He's saying things that could lead other people to adopt anti-Semitic attitudes. We're not saying he's anti-Semitic, but he is not being careful with his language, and he is not being responsible with his public platform. And we need to do something about that. Nobody listened to them. Probably a lot of this is rooted in what Karla was saying about how there is maybe a Jewish tendency. You don't want to be the leader. You don't want to be so forceful. That has changed in the landscape today in some ways, but in other ways it has not, because I have been reporting about this gesture that Elon Musk made a few weeks ago and how big Jewish communal leaders have been very hesitant. They don't know what to call it, and they are scared to say what it is. And so there are a lot of parallels with how the Jews tried to respond to Father Coughlin in the moment until his anti-Semitism became too obvious to ignore.
Yeah, no, all of that is really absolutely right. And Katie is right that it was the boycott, not the lawsuit, that finally led Ford to capitulate on all of the things that Louis Marshall, president of the American Jewish Committee, wanted to come out of this litigation that he did not think should ever have happened. So there is a tendency in so many places and at so many times where members of the Jewish community you could identify more or less as leaders have this explicit discussion about what should we do, And Marshall was sort of emblematic of the let's not draw attention to ourselves school of thought, but his whole career as an immigration lawyer was about making sure that people who came to this country as non-citizens could become citizens on the same footing as everybody else. And he also wrote extensively about how it was possible to be both Jewish and American at the same time. And so I think the ambivalence that Katie was talking about, and Clara too, about how to position themselves and how to use public speech to comment or to shape the history that they were living, was a really challenging problem. I actually do want to pivot to a fairly recent event, and that I think shows the difficulty that Michiganders have with encountering the history of anti-Semitism in their own backyard. And how many of you know about the episode of the magazine The Dearborn Historian 6 years ago? One person? Okay, so let me just summarize very quickly. This is a magazine published by the city of Dearborn, and in late 2018, the editor prepared an issue with a photo of Henry Ford on the cover alongside a quote from the International Jew, which of course I haven't memorized. But you could basically turn to any page in that book and it says the same thing. Jews are the cause of everything bad. The mayor told the editor that he could not mail that issue. And the Dearborn Historian didn't have a website. So the Detroit Free Press threw it up on their website, along with commentary about how the mayor had censored the city's publication. And again, I don't live in Michigan either. I actually live in Indiana, born in Ohio. If this event had happened next week, I'd be staying over until Wednesday to see if Purdue can beat Michigan State. Okay, fine. But I didn't get a sense, and I tried to follow this whole controversy. I didn't get a sense of how strongly local Jews responded to this. Okay, she can talk about this, great. But it seemed to me that non-Jews outside of Michigan were extremely opinionated about why the mayor's actions were illegal, if not just morally wrong. But when I wrote about it, the comments I got were essentially, on the one hand, yes, this is, a bad thing for the mayor to do, and it's part of our history. We need to grapple with it. And then the other side was, when are you guys going to stop talking about this? Also not Jewish. And you're just assigning guilt by association or by familial relationship. When, Ford's dead, and he wasn't a great guy, but he did do all these great things, which, again, I have trouble with that justification. But I think that bringing up the history of what Ford published in the 1920s makes everybody uncomfortable today, and it should, but for widely different reasons. I mean, we were told not to be too political, but the whole conversation about DEI is about erasing color and gender and ethnicity and non-evangelical religions from the picture of what America should look like. And I don't think it takes too much imagination or dodging or coded language to say that that's not the direction we should go in.
I'm going to give this to you guys, and so thank you all for a really interesting conversation. Yes, the museum doesn't want us to be too political, but if people want to ask questions about anything else, I would love to be able to offer it to the floor. We have time for some questions. Here you go.
Listening to you, and also I just read the book prequel for Rachel Maddow. I am horrified to know what happened. And I am horrified to see what is happening. I'm not talking politics. I'm just talking fascism the last 3 years. What have we learned from the past that can be applied to the condition now?
That is the question, right? I think I mean, I won't be too presumptuous. I think that question haunts everybody on this panel, certainly, because when you live in history, it all feels so obvious. Look at what happened. Look at where we went wrong. And the point of studying history should be to learn from it, and we should move forward. But in fact, what we found, and the reason why I wanted to do the Father Coughlin project, is these things are cyclical, generational. People have a very hard time learning the lessons of the past, or sifting through what those lessons should be, and that continues to this day. Well, that's, yeah, I don't.
One of the things I've noted, and I think we felt it this last year and some, the beginning, when you look at the history, which is of Jews in higher education in the U.S., right, they are the quintessential outsider. But if you follow that history, they become kind of quintessential insiders. And the interesting thing about this year since last October 7th is that it hasn't been as simple as that, obviously, but to once again really feel sort of that outsiderness. So I think, what do we learn? Maybe it's that cycle, Jews, for instance, the Jewish community is feeling very much on the outs in lots of ways, but are still insiders, and are looking at not just themselves, but other groups that are on, dangerous spaces. So a lot of it akin to what do you do with one's power as insiders? It's complicated when you also feel an outsider, but to step up even when feeling vulnerable, because we know about this history.
So I'll just give a quick plug for Jewish Historical Society. We're working on opening a museum. And part of our reason for doing it is this is a really good time to talk about the history of anti-Semitism and also the ways in which the Jewish community has made an extraordinary difference in all different arenas in Michigan. And the research is very clear about the success of Jewish museums in teaching and combating anti-Semitism even more than Holocaust centers. So it ironically is a great time to be planning for a museum. So we are in the midst of that process.
Not too political, okay. I'm also not Jewish. I'm white, I'm male, I'm advanced middle-aged. And I want to talk to the white, cis, straight Americans and say two things. One is listen. Listen. Take this seriously, right? It was one thing for African Americans to protest. It was one thing for Jews to bring lawsuits, and it was another thing for WASPs to join them, to follow them, sometimes to lead them. But listen, this is serious stuff. Take it seriously and use some of the privilege that you have, because you have it. And don't think you can't lose it. They'll come for you eventually. So that worked in the past. And if we all band together, I hope it'll work in the future.
I just wanted to note that the mayor of Dearborn who refused to allow the publication was John B. O'Reilly Jr., who passed away 6 weeks ago. May his memory be a blessing. I had the privilege of working with him on some political issues in Michigan. As a nearly lifelong Michigander with no roots in Detroit, one of the things I want to very gently suggest to especially the non-Michiganders on the panel is the conflation of Michigan and Detroit. Bothers me is too strong a word, but I'd be curious whether anybody has other information about what was going on in the period we've been discussing in outstate Michigan. My family did not grow up in Lansing, but I remember hearing in the 60s stories of the desecration of the Shaare Zedek building, that it was covered with swastikas in the 30s. There was certainly active Bund activity and active Ku Klux Klan in the area. I did a history paper at Michigan State a million years ago, where, among other things, I looked at the 1924 election, where various townships around Lansing were casually referred to as the Klan townships. This was not something that was confined to the Detroit area, and I'm wondering what else the rest of you can tell us about what was going on in the rest of the state.
So, thank you for that. I'll just say that, Alan, actually, we met when I came to Shaare Zedek to talk about Lansing and the Holocaust. Right. Yeah, and
as a result of the suggestion of that, I went to the Hancock Synagogue. Which,
did you?
A little bit after we talked. Yeah.
Cool, awesome. So yes, I can say that the same attention to fundraising is absolutely as true in Lansing as it was in Detroit. The news coverage in the Lansing state paper is I imagine that the Lansing Jewish community was supplementing its knowledge that it was getting from the local paper with the Detroit Jewish News, because the information they were getting from the local paper was very thin to non-existent. So they were getting it from somewhere, and I imagine it's from the Detroit Jewish News. But absolutely, the protesting and the fundraising pieces are equally applicable in Lansing.
I would just Howell, Michigan, also many probably know historically a huge hotbed of Klandom, Ku Klux Klan, and various hate groups as well. And just a few weeks ago, you also probably heard that a group of neo-Nazis had protested a stage production of The Diary of Anne Frank in Howell. So that was another example of where I was covering a story where I suddenly felt like the past and the present had sort of blended together in my brain in very unusual ways. But unfortunately, the rest of my knowledge as to anti-Semitism in other parts of the state is a little bit lacking. Although I do know that the first Jew ever in Michigan was a fur trader in Mackinac Island in the 1700s. And you should read my cousin Barry Stiefel's book on the history of the Jews of Michigan. He's got more information.
I don't know anything about rural Michigan, but if it's anything like rural Indiana, it has not been progressive since the demise of the populists over a century ago. In Indiana, in 2016, we had an outbreak, an epidemic of vandalism against Jewish cemeteries and synagogues. In where I live is Lafayette, Indiana. I actually live in West Lafayette. But we had a group called American Vanguard that was going around flyering. And this was not the only college campus that had that happen. But my sense, if the Midwest can be generalized, is that rural spaces tend to be more isolating, and people tend to be more afraid of new people and different-looking people and different-behaving people.
Quickly, a little sense of why people in Michigan through the state might not have loved University of Michigan. So lots of comments looking down on the agricultural college and why they needed to teach things like English and languages, as well as disdain for the legislators in Lansing. I don't think that helped the cause of the university.
Hi, born in Detroit, and I remember Father Coughlin very well. Can you tell me on the Coughlin topic, what was the role of the Vatican? Did they support him? Did they criticize him? Anything around that? Thank you.
Yeah, the Vatican largely ignored what he was doing for several years. They are one of the key, if not the key institution that could have intervened much earlier because, of course, the structure of the Vatican is strictly hierarchical. If Father Coughlin's bishop had told him, stop with your radio show, it's giving us a bad light, he would have had to do it. But his bishop was totally cool with it because Coughlin had unlocked this unique fundraising mechanism where he was pulling in tons of donations from people way outside of his parish. And they also, because the technology of radio was so new, they were also more they were giving him a lot of leeway because his radio show was not seen as occurring strictly within the bounds of his parish. And so geographically, they felt like they couldn't actually tell him what to do. When Coughlin's activities, including, writing fan mail to Mussolini and other, things like this, where he was really trying to get involved in a big way in the fascist cause, when they started reaching the upper levels of the Vatican, that was when we see a new bishop coming in who took a much more hardline approach to him in the late 30s. And it wasn't necessarily that the Vatican was worried about Coughlin's anti-Semitism, because I'm sure a lot of you know the Vatican at the time also incredibly anti-Semitic, with much more dire consequences for Italian Jews. But it was more that just he was embarrassing them. He had crossed the bounds of propriety by openly insinuating on national radio that the Jews deserved what had happened to them in Kristallnacht. And so that was why he had to be stopped, was because he was embarrassing them, and the FBI was starting to get involved because he was openly talking about sedition. So the institution mostly protects itself, as institutions tend to do.
Maybe I'll just say in 10 seconds that among Rabbi Franklin's correspondence, Temple Bethel rabbi in this period, he saved letters that he had received from people all over the country asking him not only to intervene with Henry Ford, but also Father Coughlin. And a number of those letters say, can you please go to Archbishop Mooney and try to exert some pressure on him? So that was another way that the community was trying to shut Coughlin down. Unsuccessfully, but a strategy.
All right. So unfortunately, I think we need to cut it off because we've been going so long, but I really just want to thank you all so much for fantastic questions. Thank you to the fantastic panel. It's been wonderful. I do have an announcement from Sarah Shaw, who is the director of the Foundation of the Library of Michigan, that there are some books that they would love to be able to, they've purchased for, to give to for free. Well, no, these are two different things. So sorry, there's multiple books you can get here. So number one, right, is the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan has books available from the Detroit Historical Society. The title of the book is Living Witnesses. So please, people can take that for free. There's a free book. And then also there is a raffle for other books that have been purchased by the Library of Michigan for this purpose. So if you sign your name, there's slips out there, you may win a book and they'll send it to you. So thank you all once again. This has just been wonderful. I hope that you'll take this out and do more with it. And I wish you all good luck and thank you so much.
Yeah,